You're listening to Searching for More, a podcast of the Diocese of Arlington. Join us to hear Mr. Robert McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, shed more light on the current crisis in Ukraine and what lies ahead. In 1991, amid warnings that there would be civil war and bloodshed in Ukraine if they tried to break from the Soviet Union, Ukraine's independence was peaceful and supported by 92% of the people of Ukraine. Now, 30 years later, Putin is forcing Ukraine's war of independence. Our guest was there in 1991 and has been active in Ukraine ever since. Hear him talk about what Russian rule would mean for the people of faith in the region. Today's host is Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese of Arlington.
Bob, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you've got a very interesting story. You and your wife, you're the co-founders of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, which you began more than 30 years ago. And I read that it's the oldest American presence in Ukraine with an office in Kyiv. Is that right?
That is right.
Wow.
We set up an office there when it was still the Soviet Union. It was a little, I must say, I commented to my wife, are we nuts? I mean, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation dedicated to democratic institution building in Ukraine, and we're not very far from the communist headquarters.
Right, yeah. Now, so it's your wife, you're not Ukrainian, but your wife's parents are, is that right?
My wife, she always says she was born on the way. Her parents left Western Ukraine ahead of the Red Army. Their intentions walking into Austria with a cart and a cow. The cow they lost, they had to use it for bargaining a river or something. But they intended to go back, and Nadia was born in Austria, and then the Red Army kept coming and was rounding up people that had been in the Soviet Union and sending them back, and so they just kept going. And they were in a DP camp until Nadia was about 5.5, 6 years old when they got permission to come to this country.
Wow. So I imagine the news is just perplexing to them, that it's almost like history repeating itself here.
Well, her parents have passed away, and I mean, in a way we're glad, they're not seeing this. Nadia, it's interesting, going through all this and working day and night, trying to deal with getting aid there and all the other things the foundation does. She woke up the other morning, it was like flashback because, World War, we often read about World War II veterans, just came home and didn't talk about the war. Well, that wasn't the case of the immigrants. It was certainly not the Ukrainian immigrants after World War II. They immigrated to essentially a Ukrainian ghetto in Chicago. And, after church on Sunday, all the families would get together, and that's what they talked about. They talked about what had gone on under the Soviet Union, why they had left and so forth, and the brutality of the system and so forth. And Nadia says until she moved to Arizona after high school, that was part of the routine discussion, and it's just bringing it all back.
Yeah. Wow. So she's obviously struggling seeing what's going on there, but you all have an office in Kyiv, is that right? Are you in regular contact with folks there?
Oh, yes. It's interesting, when we opened up our office in Kiev, very shortly after we opened it up, we established, obviously we were establishing a foreign entity in the country, so we also created a Ukrainian entity, the Philip Orlik Institute for Democracy. Philip Orlik was a hetman that ruled the Ukrainian country way back before our independence, and established a very democratic constitution with separation of powers and so forth. And the reason we set that up was to remind Ukraine that it had its own democratic traditions. They didn't really have to look elsewhere for them. So the Institute is there. The several people that work at the Institute are it's a joint office, or in the office. The guy who has run our Kiev office for almost a full 30 years is a British Ukrainian, and he had to fly home to bury his sister. He's on his way back, but he's not going back to the office. He and some other British expats are picking up guns and joining the militia. So we have an office. If you ring the office, people will answer, but our guy is going to be out on the front lines.
Wow. So when you survey the situation that's going on, it's wild how short this time has been, and yet how much has happened. Because it was not long ago that, the Russians, their ambassador, I think it was, to the U.S. was still saying, no, this is defensive in case something was to happen to us. And doing that while, troops were basically already moving across the border. It's stunning.
Right.
Is there something that you think, so you're obviously, your presence there is to help proliferate democracy in Ukraine, and then we see what's happening here with Russia. But what do you think is the obligation of the United States in providing security for the Ukraine or for the Ukrainian people? Like, what do you see as the role of the United States in this situation?
Well, when I answer that question, I acknowledge that our government rejects what I'm going to say, but I don't think it's any less valid. In 1994, there was a Budapest Memorandum signed by the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Ukraine. Ukraine signed that Budapest Memorandum, and in return for quote-unquote assurances of its sovereignty and borders, it turned over the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine to Russia. When Ukraine became independent, they had that huge nuclear arsenal. Now, it gets complex, and it's not a simple thing. The Kremlin had control over those silos and so forth, but they were on Ukrainian territory. They were in possession of Ukraine, if not under control of Ukraine. And Ukraine wanted to get rid of them. But they did not want to give them to Russia. They knew instinctively and from history that they did not want what they called the center to have those weapons. So it took several years for the United States and others to put pressure on and work out a deal that Ukraine would turn over those weapons. Russia would give some nuclear fuel back for Ukraine's power stations. But the key part was there would be assurances by the three other powers for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, the word that was used was assurances. And if you force somebody from our government to talk about it, they say, well, it wasn't a guarantee, it was assurance. Well, I'm sorry. I really think that's bunk.
Yeah.
Starting to talk about legal technicalities when you knew then and you know now that Ukraine thought an assurance meant people were going to stand with them if Russia attacked. So I think, one, we have an obligation, if you want to call it a moral obligation to live up to what we said, call it a moral obligation. But we have an obligation, and we have not lived up to it ever since.
So what would be the difference that they would describe between an assurance and what was the other word you used? A promise or something? What's the difference?
A guarantee. I mean,
a guarantee and an assurance.
I mean, you can use the word guarantee, and it has a different definition than assurance. But to the people that we will give you this if you do that. Well, they did the that, and we're not doing the this.
Right. Yeah. If I assure my wife of something, she's expecting it to happen.
Yeah, I can
guarantee
you, in a marital situation, the difference between assurance and guarantee would not be. You wouldn't win that argument.
Right. Nor should you. So what do you see beyond the obvious? I mean, is there anything that we're missing that's a risk in the U.S. not taking a more active role? Obviously, the obvious risk is that the whole country is consumed into Russia and becomes essentially Russian-occupied territory. Are there other risks that the average person like me might not be aware of or see?
Well, yes. I mean, Putin has, when he talks about Ukrainian history and other things, I don't know if you can call them lies. They're not truthful, but I think he has a KGB education on the history of things, and so he thinks Ukraine is his. It's not, never was. Ukraine's older than Russia. I mean, we can go into a lot of history here. There's a number of people. Tim Snyder did a fabulous webinar a few weeks ago about all this. But the danger here is Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine.
Right.
I mean, I know a lot of experts say, oh, he won't go into a NATO country. I mean, maybe they're right, but I don't see where they get their determination to say that. If he's not stopped, why would he stop? He's not a person that stops. Maybe he wouldn't go into a NATO country next if he took over all of Ukraine. But, boy, ask the Finns if they're worried. They're not in NATO, and he has always said Finland is really Russia, too. So the Finns are nervous, and they're trying to get into NATO now. He has Putin's designs are not for the return of the Soviet Union. It's for the Russian Empire. And he's made that clear.
Yeah.
He's just going to keep going until he's stopped. And indeed, I mean, I know this is radical in this town that's so hesitant to do what it should, but the objective right now should not be to stop the war in Ukraine. The objective needs to be to defeat Putin. Otherwise, the war will just keep going. If we have some kind of a stop and he occupies part or he does not, whatever that might be, if he hasn't been stopped, he will keep, and we will be fighting Putin for a very long time, and it could get a lot more costly than doing what we need to do now.
Yeah, and the political consequences are obvious. The human consequences are obvious. One angle, though, that I'm curious about, and you maybe have some perspective on, obviously you have familiarity with Russia, but what would people of faith expect under a Russian regime? Obviously, under the Soviet regime, there really was no permission of religion. It does seem like there's some religion happening in Russia. It's not quite as restrictive as China, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But what would people of faith expect in terms of their freedom in Russia?
Well, I'm not clear on all different parts of Christian faith and so forth. But the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy has been and is an arm of the KGB. That doesn't mean the priests out in the diocese and so forth are, but the church itself, Patriarch Kirill and so forth, are their mouthpieces for the Kremlin.
Right.
Now, so if Russia took over Ukraine, the situation for faith in Ukraine would be what it was under the Soviet Union. Under the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Catholics and the Ukrainian Orthodox were subsumed, at least all their church property and so forth, by the Russian Orthodox Church. The Orthodox, and by the way, while faith was discouraged, repressed, and so forth throughout the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Catholic Church was illegal. It was the largest underground church in the world.
Wow.
Masses were said in the forest. Masses were said in the underground. It stayed alive, but it was persecuted. It was definitively persecuted. When the World War II was over, the leader of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Cardinal Joseph Slipy, was taken to Moscow because he was a powerful political and religious leader in Ukraine. And Stalin offered him the head of the Russian Orthodox Church if he would denounce Rome. He wouldn't do it. He spent 17 years in a death camp for that.
Wow.
He was the model of the movie In the Shoes of the Fisherman, I think it was. Eventually, he was freed. Khrushchev didn't think he was alive, and Kennedy asked for him and got him to say if he's alive, he'll send. So Sleepy came out. But the church was the largest underground church, I think, in the history of the world. And that had all happened again. I mean, it took a lot of... When independence came, one of the most ticklish things was sorting out how to get church property back to the churches that really belonged to. And so people of faith are terrified about what would come with Russian domination.
Wow. Yeah, that's very telling, and it justifies the intensity of the situation and why people are so concerned in many ways. And, you know, my son was asking about the fight in Ukraine because we're praying every night for them and for the people there and all. And so I looked up a map because he was trying to understand where it was. And I knew where Ukraine was. What I didn't realize until I looked at it was that it's basically a plug that separates Russia from all of Western Europe. Because you have Belarus to the north, which is very pro-Russian. But when you look at it, you realize, oh my heavens, like it explained what would come next. Now, once you get west of Ukraine, you get to a lot of NATO countries, and that's where it's the big question is, would Putin be willing to go that far? Is he willing to fight all of NATO and kind of call them on their bluff? Who knows? But,
well, I mean, that's the equation as stated. I'm not sure NATO. I'm not sure what NATO would do.
Yeah.
If there was a quote unquote an incursion as opposed to an invasion. Yeah. I mean, NATO hasn't shown a great stiffness of spine. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, you know, people have always argued, you know, Ukraine shouldn't be let into NATO. It's too this, that. It's not ready. What NATO country could do what Ukraine is doing now in the face of the Russian invasion?
It's so courageous to see just everybody picking up arms.
There's no NATO country except me. Well, no, there is no NATO country with an army capable of what Ukraine is doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it requires the will of the people, and they're certainly a tough people. So the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, what is, under normal times, what is your core work? What are you looking to achieve, and what are the goals that you have set, kind of year to year?
Okay, setting aside war.
right. Setting aside war and
little thing like war.
Yeah.
Well, our intention when we set up in Ukraine was, as I said, democratic institution building and helping establish and strengthen U.S.-Ukraine relations. We did that, and it's kind of an evolutionary thing that's gotten us to where we are now. Back when the Soviet Union came apart, the United States and a lot of other countries had institutions, both governmental and non-governmental, that were trying to assist in those countries. The foundation was created, in one sense, to get some of the money that, I'll put it bluntly, what the U.S. government would normally come up with, what they think ought to be done in Ukraine, and let out contracts to what are often called the Beltway Bandits, and they would go in and do it. Nadia's idea was come up with unsolicited proposals about what needs to be done in Ukraine, see if we can get them funded and do them. Our first one, we were too small not to carry out the project really, but to deal with all the financial bureaucracy of a major government program. And so we linked up with Indiana University and got a legislative development program. That was the first one we went in with and that was at the request of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, because they admitted to themselves in the Soviet years they were nothing more than a rubber stamp, and they were now going to need to be a viable legislature. So we set up this program, how to set up an appropriations process, how to set up committees and have working committees and so forth. And we were as studious about, if a communist came to us and said, could I get a comparative study between how the Finns and the French do this, we would do that. We didn't, whether they were a member of the reformers, the independence movement, or the communists, if we got a request, we treated them all the same. And that 4 or 5 year program was a huge, you can talk to the parliamentarians from back then. It was a huge help for them in sorting out how they wanted to operate. We had other smaller grants from different places. We had grants from European institutions and so forth. But the big one was, Nadia said, Ukraine is going to reform, but it's going to take forever. But the best place to get started is at the local level. So she came up with an unsolicited proposal to match 18 Ukrainian mid-sized cities and 18 U.S. mid-sized cities in what she called the Community Partnership Program. It might sound something like sister cities, but it wasn't. These were not just cultural things. You matched the city, and then those cities got together and came up with a work plan of things they were work on to achieve together. All 18 came up with economic development as number one, but they all had different things. They had, water project problems. They had this. And I also add, she made sure that the 18 U.S. cities did not have a noticeable Ukrainian diaspora. She did not want to get involved in diaspora politics. She wanted to have America to Ukraine. I bring that up because we learned that it had an impact that we did not anticipate. We unleashed what best America has to offer, which was American citizens volunteering. Ukrainian language did not have a word for volunteer until this project. And you saw mayors spending their vacations in Ukraine. You saw the head of Springfield, Illinois' water system, spending it in Ukraine and so forth. But the thing about not having Ukrainian Americans, we learned almost uniformly from all 18 cities, was that after those first visits, when they sat down and they came up with what their work plan was, the Americans said, okay, we'll be back in 3 months, 4 months, whatever it was. We will have done this, and we'll come back prepared with this. You need to do these things. And the Americans left, and the Ukrainians, in so many words, they told us, if those were Ukrainian Americans, we would have just, kind of discounted it because they think we can do things we don't think we can do. These were American Americans. They're going to come back and they're going to have this done. We better get our butts in gear. And we heard it over and over again. And all the work plans were met. It was a 10-year program. And not only did those 18 cities, and a lot of the partnerships are going on now, even without the official program. I'm not sure how the war is disturbing it, but
I was just thinking that.
That'll be interesting to hear about. But the unanticipated consequences were magnificent. I could go on for days with that. One of the ones I love the most, the mayor of Cross-Ladone was partnered with Athens, Georgia. And he's going from meeting to meeting one winter in Athens, Georgia, and he says, what are those yellow buses? Those are school buses. They're what? They're school buses. System, we pick up kids, get them to school, take them home. Well, in the Soviet Union, there wasn't anything like that. And so some parents could spend, especially in the winter, a good portion of the day just getting their kids to school and back safely. Well, he went back home, took some buses out of the bus system, painted them yellow, of course, and started a school bus system. Well, he's mayor for life. I mean, all of a sudden there's school bus systems popping up around Ukraine because these various mayors were, telling each other what they were doing and so forth. And we also had 4 training centers throughout Ukraine, and I think the number was 65,000 local civil servants were trained at those centers. I mean, and they started doing stuff that we were talking about transparency, so the citizens would know what was going on, because when a city councilman from Ukraine would come here at the early part of the program and go to a city council meeting, and there's people yelling at the city council and they were horrified. You let them in your meetings? Well, open meetings started taking place in Ukraine.
That's fascinating because we don't think of these things as innovations like school buses and city council meetings. Boy, it makes hearing it makes me so grateful. Yeah, I mean they're evolving out of that archaic system and that kind of death grip that they would have on power. And it just makes you so grateful to not be in that situation. But I mean, it demonstrates the impact that you've been able to have, that simple things like that can change people's lives.
The other thing was because in the early years after each trip, the American mayors would stop here in Washington so we could catch up and coordinate and so forth. And I started not acting surprised but I knew it was coming. The people from the U.S. cities, Birmingham, all the different places, they come in and say, we're learning how to improve our city. And I go, how do you mean? Well, when you sit down with them and talk to them about what they can do, you all of a sudden realize we could be doing better than we're doing.
Yeah.
So it was mutually beneficial.
It's kind of like an audit of yourself. You're hearing what others are doing, and it makes you think about it. So as we're watching the Russian violence and the armies push forward and the Ukrainians continue to fight to the death and really give everything to always stand on the soil of a free Ukraine, I think everybody here wonders, what could we do? And so we've promoted things like the Central and Eastern European Second Collection that just happened and things like that. But you're in a unique position. So what is your message when people say, what can we do? What do you encourage them to consider?
Well, I'm going to give you a little bit longer answer than you expect. First of all, to understand what's going on in the Ukrainian mind and so forth, I think you reflect back. If you can remember, or if the audience can remember, in 1991, when it started to look like Ukraine was pulling away, wanting to be independent, all of the governments in the West, all of the elites were saying, "Oh no, that'll bring war. There will be bloodshed. It will be civil war." And then even, I remember the headline, "It will lead to nuclear chaos." Well, it didn't. 92% of the people of Ukraine, in a democratic election on a referendum for independence, voted for independence. Independence came to Ukraine peacefully, totally peacefully, because of what Putin is doing. 30 years later, the Ukrainian people are fighting their war of independence. And when they fight that war, unlike Americans who've been sitting comfortably and complacently for years and years and decades and a century, they remember living under the oppression of the Soviet Union, of the center, as they called it. They know what it was like. They remember the Holodomor. They remember what it was like in World War II. They remember the people being shipped off to the Gulag. They're fighting for freedom with a passion because they know what it's like not to have freedom. That's what you're seeing in those scenes and reading about. What we're doing at the foundation, and mostly my end of the thing, is working, criticizing, pushing our government to do more. The other part of what the foundation is doing, and Nadia is leading, is the humanitarian effort. Putting together at the foundation partners, the American Hospital Association, March of Dimes. I mean, they keep coming in. I'm not up to date because I haven't been downstairs this morning. They are collecting medical supplies and other supplies. Nadia's arranging for where they can be brought to storerooms. She's arranging for planes to get them to Poland and arranging for the transportation. I mean, the critical part is a lot of people are raising money, not necessarily. I don't know, I'm not going to single out in people. A lot of them are being very successful, but some are getting them to Poland, but don't have a means to get them where they need to go in Ukraine. That's where a lot of our connections and so forth. Our first plane of medical supplies landed on Sunday, and there were trucks there immediately to get it to the military hospitals, which was that particular load's destination. So we're doing that, and if anybody is interested, it's very easy to access what we're doing. The website is usukraine.org, and it's got a place to donate to the foundation, which needs money to carry on its activities, I might say desperately. It also has a place where you can give to the humanitarian effort, and that money goes to that effort, that getting the supplies that are being donated by the American Hospital Association and these other places, getting them on a plane and getting them to where they need to be.
Wow. Well, listen, Bob McDonald, you're co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, usukraine.org, you said?
Yes.
.org. Thank you so much.
Google and just type in U.S.-Ukraine, it pops up.
Gotcha. Well, we're just so grateful for the work that you and your wife are doing, but particularly now, there's obviously a specific focus on this, and it's tragic to see what's happening. Parents like me were having to explain it to our kids, and it's hard to explain because you can't fathom. This type of evil is hard to comprehend, and to explain it's even harder.
That's the word. I mean, we don't use it that often in our society, but it is evil.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, be assured of our continued prayers. Again, anyone that's interested in checking out what Bob's doing there, Bob and his wife, it's usukraine.org. Bob, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're listening to Searching for More. If you enjoyed this podcast, please write a review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Also, make sure you follow the Diocese and the Arlington Catholic Herald on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to our YouTube channels for regular videos that inspire, educate, and inform about the Catholic faith in our diocesan community.